with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show.
Okay, everybody. Really excited for this conversation. As always, thank you for checking in wherever you are in the world. I have today Nicole Ferry, and she is a tenure-track assistant professor at the Copenhagen Business School. She has published in the world's best journals, and her current work explores the competitive and cultural dynamics of the leadership industries, as well as contemporary approaches to gender-based leadership development. And so there's some things, just even what I just said. Of course, more of her bio is in the show notes, so please check that out. But I'm so excited, Nicole. I know you're just coming off of Academy of Management, so that was just held in Copenhagen. I hope that was absolutely incredible. And I think where we're going to take the conversation today is just a very open-ended question of what's on your mind. But before we do that, what do listeners need to know about you? What are a couple fun facts that, will introduce you a little bit to folks who are listening right now?
Thank you for having me on the show. And yes, the Academy was just here, and it was incredible to have that big of a conference in your own backyard where you didn't have to pre-plan your outfits and you could just, go with what the weather was actually like. So that was super nice. And it was actually nice also to have it in one spot versus like jumping from building to building, which sometimes the Academy has.
Yes.
So things to know about me. I think one of the things that is important to know is that I work at a business school. Obviously, I work at Copenhagen Business School, but I do not have a business school background. My background is actually in critical theory and cultural studies. So I've spent a lot of time looking at race, class, gender, sex, sexuality, ageability, and how all of those things sort of play out in terms of education, in terms of institutions and the like. And so I take that lens, that critical lens, and I sort of apply it to leadership and leadership development and different dynamics therein. And so I think that really shapes the kind of scholarship that I do and also the kind of ways that I think about leadership, which maybe are often more from a critical lens.
I just always love our conversations. And I think that's where I want to start. Like, what are you thinking about now? I know you've had some recent publications that were pretty awesome, some nice hits. And so we could go in that direction, but there could just be other things that are just kind of on your mind right now that have caught your attention that you're pondering. I think that's where I'd love to begin the conversation.
Yeah. So I think both what I'm thinking about and my current publications are in line. And so I've been just thinking a lot about men, actually. So maybe you can relate. So I've been thinking a lot about what are men's roles in leadership and also how we can think more critically about men's roles in gender equity and equality within organizations. And so I just recently published a piece in AMLE, the Academy of Management, Learning and Education, on a proposal to create men's leadership development, which I know sounds funny, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue in the same way that we've so often heard women's leadership development. But it's sort of a piece to provoke, but also to hopefully inspire maybe some more practical elements within organizations when it comes to how we address gender equity.
So talk more about that. So men's leadership development. I've literally never had a conversation about this. So super excited. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah. So really, maybe I'll just go back for a second because this started as just sort of a thought experiment. And like I said, sort of a provocation because we have for a long time and for very good reason had a focus on women's leadership development. Like women have been historically marginalized from leadership positions. There's also been the idea that men are sort of the prototypical leaders, think manager, think male for Shine's work. And so I think originally I was just sort of saying, okay, well, when you have women's leadership development and then you don't have men's leadership development, then when you just have leadership, it kind of codes it as for men or masculine. And so it's in the same way that you can think about, I do some work with the restaurant industry and there's awards for best chef and best woman chef, right? There's not an award for like best man chef or things like that because we sort of code and expectations into our language and things like that. And Bert Spector has also written about this, as many feminist scholars, about sort of the ways that our language masks the normative expectations or privilege and power. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe if we have women's leadership development, then we should also have men's leadership development to like rectify that. And so it just sort of started as a playful thing. But then it really turned into thinking like, okay, well, what if we took that seriously? And what if we really thought like, well, what would it take to do a men's leadership development program with the aim of gender equity? And so that is what I started to develop with this article. And of course, the AMLE reviewers really pushed me to do that more in depth and theoretically than I maybe started with. And so I sort of developed 3 different elements, which if you want, we can talk through those.
Please. Let's do it.
Yeah. So these are not kind of the end all be all elements, but I was just thinking about, there's always the phrase that you add women and stir. And that's been a critique of leadership programs where you've just thrown women in and then they've sort of become trained and assimilated to take up like masculine performances of leadership. And so there's been a critique. And I was thinking, okay, well, we have women's leadership development. So we have one form of what I call gender-based leadership development. So that's like leadership targeted or aimed towards a particular gender. And you use gender as a means to sort of develop leaderness. And I thought, okay, well, we have that, but you can't just add men and stir to women's leadership development because men are socialized differently. They navigate organizations differently and have different privileges and power in organizations. And so I thought, okay, well, you have to expand the women's leadership blueprint, and you also have to expand just the general leadership development blueprint, okay, to account for like the social positions of men. And so the first one was, okay, reflexive identity development. And so we know in leadership development, there's a lot of identity work. So cultivating the self, a lot of kind of inward focus, and that sometimes happens through like personality assessments or different kind of reflective exercises and such. And I thought, okay, well, that's great. But if you do that for men and you don't connect personal identity to broader issues of gender and power, then that's not necessarily going to create gender equity because you could have then, let's say, Tom, and Tom realizes that he's like really good at this and this, and that he succeeded maybe because of these things. But that doesn't necessarily account for the fact that like gender and masculinity and those things, when they mapped into the body, are read differently than if somebody else were to do that. And so, for example, it's kind of that it breaks down that idea of meritocracy or the idea that we've all just achieved where we are just because of how hard we worked. And so critical feminist scholars and race scholars and all the critical theory folks will tell you that there's more to it than that. Yeah. So if you're just doing identity development that's isolated from these larger socialization practices and larger privilege and systemic systems, then that could do a disservice to leadership development. And so I'm saying if men are going to do identity development, that's great, but always in connection to understanding how gender works in organizations, how their gender works. That's the first one.
I'm assuming, but I don't want to, so just so we're on the same page, that these would be leader development programs really with just males as participants. That this would be led by a male, and then it's male participants who are in a space and even exploring that concept just in a space where they're dialoguing. Is that accurate? Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yes and no. And it's a nice transition to the second element, actually. I mean, yeah, I think, again, This is a kind of a conceptual exercise that I want to put in practice, but I think, and we can talk about this a little later, I think there are limitations, of course, to actually like implementing these kinds of things. But yeah, in the same way that, you've had women having shared spaces, there's also evidence that men, when they're amongst other men, that can be a very influential process. And so, yeah, I think that it's important that maybe if these were to be implemented, that it would be people who identify as men in this group working together. But having said that, the second element that I have is called intersectional relationality. And that's the idea that leadership should be built or should be conceptualized as a practice of relationship building, which I know many of your guests have talked about that in various ways. And there's great work on distributed and collaborative and relational leadership and all these things. And so it's the idea that we want to do that kind of relationality work, but through also accounting for intersectionality, which means that like when you and I come to build a relationship, it's not like we necessarily meet on an equal level playing field where you're going to have no biases of me or you, right? And we just get to navigate as two equal parties. Actually, of course, just like in the first thing, our identities matter and they show up in various ways. And so you have to think about building relationships while always also staying attuned to the fact that race, class, gender, and systems of patriarchy and racism and things like that will shape how we get to relate and show up and things like that. And so one of the things about that is that if leadership is in a practice of relationship building, then that means that we need to build, of course, between genders, so men in the group, but also across genders to women. And of course, in this sense, I'm doing a very binary, like men and women gender thing, but there are multiple genders and things like that they can, that men can build relationships with. And that could include also not just having male or men as facilitators, but also having maybe women as facilitators as well, and thinking about what that might look like. So yes, I do think it's important to have men working with men, but I think that there also needs to be an effort to hear from other voices, because feminist work is very big on the fact that like narratives and storytelling is a big part of how you can like change narratives or change the story and all that kind of stuff. So that is the second one, intersectional.
Okay. Cool. Right. And three
is organizational accountability. So this is shifting the idea that leadership development happens in these sort of like one-off programmatic models, which we know both in women's leadership development and in just general leadership development, that can be ineffective in actually changing the way organizations work. It's not like you go to one workshop and you're just a changed human and all of a sudden then you get to become a leader. And I know like Kellerman, for example, has talked about that the development industry, the leadership industries work in that way. But my point here would be that if you actually want to advance gender equity, that we should expand beyond just these kind of like programmatic standalone models and make certain practices or features of leadership development part of men's roles in the organization itself. So for example, tracking metrics that we know shape gender inequity in organizations like family leave or the pay gap or bonuses or things like that. If we actually track, doing that kind of work is actually doing the work of leadership development, that you do that outside of the program, but the expectation is that it would happen in kind of your daily work.
Okay, so my head's in like 4 places right now.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can unpack some of this. I love the notion of having a space. One insight that I've had of doing 5 years of this podcast is that I have found myself in conversations that really challenge me, challenge my own thinking. I didn't even know they were a concept. I didn't have awareness. Again, I am a white male heterosexual from North America, and that's just my lived history. That's my worldview. That's what I've experienced. And so something I've loved about this podcast is that I have had conversations with people who've opened my eyes to a number of different perspectives and realities. And so having a place where some of those conversations can happen, I think is super important. And even to build awareness, because so many things I'm not aware of. I mean, really the only thing I am like really firmly embedded in, and as an opinion, is that I am not aware of the whole. That's my hard kind of reality, is that there's a lot that I'm not seeing and experiencing and living. And so having a space to be exposed to some of that, especially for white men, at least in the context of the United States, I think could open a lot of eyes, because I think a lot of people are blind to some of those realities. how we create that space, I think, is incredibly important, because we've all sat in sessions and conversations, maybe where it's around DEI, for instance, where people are afraid to bring their full selves to the conversation. White men, for instance, in the room, because they're afraid that they're going to be offensive, or that they're going to trip on something, or that they're going to say something that is going to be experienced in not the way they intended. So at least what I've observed in some of those situations is people stay quiet, they don't bring their full selves, and they stay safe. So creating that space where some of that conversation can happen, it seems fundamental. Would you agree with that? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think recognizing privilege is like a fundamental part of this, because privilege is invisible to those who have it. That's how it operates and works at a fundamental level. And so I really think that that's one of the things to break through with men's leadership development is like, women are very aware that they're women leaders, but men just get to be leaders and not think, right? And so just briefly, I do this fantastic activity with my students and I think it could be implemented, for example, in organizations where I have 3 people who identify as women come up and 3 people who identify as men come up. And the women are the interviewers, men are the interviewees, and they ask them a series of questions that I've already created for them. And all of these questions basically flip the narrative of what's typically or has been historically asked to women in positions or in interview positions. And so, for example, they'll ask things like, are you comfortable working on a female-dominated team? And, oh, that's a nice shirt. Do you think it might distract others in the office, or they might not take you as seriously? Or what does it mean for you to be a male leader or a man leader? And then they launch these questions at them, and you watch men realize that they've never actually had to address these kinds of questions. And so often what they say back is, oh, I don't know. And the thing is it's not to like make them seem like they're inadequate interviewees, but sort of to point out the fact that like, pretty much every woman could tell you in that classroom quickly how their gender's affected their leadership style. But for men to actually think how their gender has affected their leadership style, like takes a minute sometimes, or we end with we ask the men, how will you raise up the next generation of men as leaders? Because women are always asked, like, what are you going to do to raise up And so it's like supposed to be like provocative and funny, but with the intent to sort of like stir, because it is a privilege, I would argue, to not have to have thought about these things, right? To just get to lead. And so connecting that to the second half of what you said in terms of creating a safe space, I mean, there are many ways to do it. And I think that this article that I just published sort of falls short in the real practicalities of implementing. But I do think, of course, using techniques like humor and like embodied activities, I feel like are really important for these kind of things, because often if you don't feel it, you don't necessarily get it. And so having these kind of aha moments, I think, are really important. But I think in addition to that, the organization itself also has to create the importance of this kind of work. I mean, if you just mandate men and say, go and do this leadership training to become gender equity, that could create really initial defensiveness and all these kinds of things that I don't think creates a supportive environment. All the research for like men's allyship and men's activism for gender equity shows the same thing, that like people themselves have to get on board. Yeah. But I will just add that I do think there is a current moment that's happening in terms of this attention that we're started to put on men and masculinity in public discourse, not just in like leadership discourse, but you have people on both the right and the left talking about like the crisis of men and masculinity, the male loneliness epidemic, that men are leading in things like deaths of despair and different things like that. And so you have a heightened attention on men. And of course, then you have the manosphere and the Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson's coming up. So I think right now is an important moment to not to start because people have been doing this for a long time, but to give attention to men in leadership development, to sort of acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of men, I think, that are saying, well, we don't know how to be men anymore, which is problematic. And we can discuss that in a sense, but to sort of tap into an interest in understanding performing manhood and masculinity, and to shape that in a way that supports rather than detracts from gender equity. I think that it's a good time to start doing that, because certainly the alt-right or the more manosphere groups are certainly offering a playbook for how to be a man. And I would say that it is not one that necessarily supports at all gender equity. And so we could take the interest in learning what it means to be a man and harness that and use that in a way that's for good.
Yeah. I mean, what I love about your work and what I love about what you're exploring is I think How do you help build awareness, but in a way that it can be heard, in a way that where it's not going to cause individuals to puff up and to become resentful or to lash out or to just really create an environment where people can understand. And I don't know. I don't even know how to verbalize what I'm thinking right now, Nicole. And that's what's so interesting, because I want to learn. I want to understand and better kind of navigate some of the conversations, especially when you get into, now we're going to have, men and women, people identify as men and women having conversations and trying to understand. So even the scaffolding of, okay, how do we have these conversations? How are we going to enter the space? How do we stay open? How do we work to empathize? How do we work to really truly listen so that we can hear what the other person's experiences are and what they're saying? So I'm just kind of fascinated by how we create that space so that, again, people don't puff up, people don't get back and get defensive, people stay open, people don't feel judged if they ask a question that might be a little bit off base, or because, again, the only thing I can kind of relate it to is in some of the conversations I've been in around DEI, and I literally just watch the room and I watch the men, especially the white men, begin to shrink, disengage, and they don't even know how to contribute, so it stalls. Does that make sense when I say that?
Yeah. I mean, I've been teaching DEI related courses for almost 10 years now, or over 10 years now. And there's a very particular way that you have to do it. And I've taught at predominantly white institutions, predominantly institutions of higher class levels and things like that. And so I'm talking to sort of the privileged groups often if we're thinking about certain identity categories. And there's a certain way that you have to do it to sort of, and I don't think that I've necessarily figured that out, but I do think humor is important. I think creating spaces where people can say the wrong thing and not be sort of immediately cast out is important. So not necessarily safe spaces, but safe spaces of accountability, right? Where you can, you can voice what you want, but necessarily also will need to know if what you're saying is something that might marginalize somebody else. I think, as I said, sort of embodied activities help with that. I also think that the way you frame certain things. So I think if you come in and you individualize a problem, that's never helpful. So I can't walk into a room and point to the men and be like, you're sexist and you're sexist, because that would really that would sort of shut the conversation down. But it's sort of oftentimes what I do is I try to make sure that they understand that these things are like systemic issues that they often participate in and can enable or can work against. And I think that maybe helps sometimes I'm thinking more of students and stuff, but help them to kind of see that there's some wiggle room here. I mean, often too, when you talk about gender as a social construction, which I think, for example, in the men's leadership developments would be something that's really important. So moving away from that essentialist notion that, you are this way because of your particular genitalia or your hormone levels or whatever it might be, right? That men are born this way, they are this way. You move to a socially constructed understanding. So you come to understand that, you have social institutions and family and religion and government that shape what we understand what it means to be a man. And once you understand, I think that gender is socially constructed in this way and then performed, you then get a little bit of wiggle room to sort of say, okay, well, I could perform differently. Yeah. Or I can enact, that kind of leadership style in a different way, that it's not like predestined or predetermined. And I think that that's really important for people to feel that they still have agency in these kinds of discussions and it's not like predetermined.
Yeah. And I think, again, maybe my mind is stuck here too much, but how it's set up, I think it is an art form. I really do. I think it's an art form because you need people to stay in a place of maintaining an openness, and you're not going to win with everyone, of course. But to your point, we're not shutting things down right away because I think the topic is so incredibly important. And again, it wasn't until I started doing some leader development programs that were with the YWCA in the United States, or a bank that I work with has a business interest group of women. So I did some programming with them, and I would go and have sessions and they would say things to me like, it takes me 15 minutes to choose what I'm going to wear every morning because I want to look stylish, but I don't want to look provocative. And me, like literally a second to decide what I wear. Or, everyone else in the C-suite, they have stay-at-home partners. I don't. I can't drop everything and go to China tomorrow That's not how I work. So my eyes were opened to so many differences that I was completely blind to, had no sense of. And there's so much value in that, because then I think you can better understand, right?
Yeah.
And that's what so much of this is about. It's just even an understanding and eyes being open to some of the lived experiences. My wife will come home and say, this person said this to me in a meeting today, and I was totally taken aback. And I'm like, that's a thing? I never even would have imagined that's something you could experience, but it's happening and I'm blind to it. I don't see it.
Yeah. Well, and I think, if you move beyond just like the men who might participate in this imaginary leadership development program, and you just move to thinking about the idea of men's leadership development, it speaks a little bit to what you're talking about in terms of responsibility and sort of like the mental load and the tax that's put on women to do. So often, even though women's leadership development is maybe a well-meaning initiative, it still means that women are then going to do these trainings and do this sort of maybe extra work on top of their other work, while men get to stay in the office and do the things right in front of the boss and get that done right. And it also, when it's constantly women that are having to sort of, quote, fix themselves to be more leaderly, men are then sort of let off the hook for all of that responsibility to do any of that kind of personal work on their own leadership development style as it relates to their gender. And it also just like removes of the responsibility that they have to also participate in gender equity initiatives. Like, so women's leadership development, if it's framed as a gender equity initiative in organizations, that is great and that is important, but is not just women's responsibility. So just to create a men's leadership development program would sort of highlight and showcase like that men bear that same responsibility to make change. And there's plenty of research and history that shows that we also need men to be involved in these kinds of initiatives, that it shouldn't just be that responsibility for women.
Yep. Anything else that you want listeners to know? Because we're going to begin to wind down our time. Yeah. Of course, I'll put links in the show notes to the article and to other resources that we'll talk about. But anything else that you want to underscore as you think about this? Do you know of any, real quick question, or of any men's leadership development programs? I mean, obviously there's men's groups. That has existed for decades. But do you know of any that are framed specifically in this way?
Yeah, I mean, so in the article, I talk a little bit about the idea that there's groups outside of organizations, of course, that are operating. So you have a range there. You have groups that, of course, are more interested in sort of the gender transformative initiatives that focus on healthy masculinities and do some of the kind of work we were talking about earlier. Those are nonprofits often, kind of things like that. And then you go to the other side, which are gender reinforcing programs. And those are often those pay to play commercial workshops to awaken your inner warrior out in the desert with the fire and the meat and things like that.
Yeah.
And so those are available. And then in terms of what's offered inside organizations, I mean, there is nowhere near the number of men's leadership development programs, initiated in organizations as there is for women. Like it's almost virtually non-existent. But there are certain consultancies and certain programs that target organizations to sort of help men. So there's this program, the acronym is MALE, and that's, I think, run in Australia, perhaps. There's also the Better Man movement, which will come and hold workshops for men and things like that. So there's opportunities where organizations can send their aspiring men leaders to go to these kinds of healthy masculinities consultancy workshops, but really nothing as instituted and as commonplace as women's leadership development. In terms of your question about anything else, I'll say that after having said all of this, I think I would like to live in a world where we actually don't have any of this. So I think that sort of gender-based leadership development, be it for men or women, can walk a dangerous line in several ways. I mean, one, if we have men's leadership and women's leadership development, of course, you've excluded a number of other gender identities and things like that. So it creates a binary that actually doesn't exist. And I think in addition to that, it also sort of misrepresents what gender is and how it functions, because gender isn't this like stable category. Of course, intersectionality is hugely important here. But then, in addition to that, it's not something you can like grab onto and use to train. It doesn't work like that. And when you have that women should lead like this or women leaders are like this, you can so quickly fall into this sort of essentializing narrative. And so I try best in this article to make the men's leadership development program that I proposed to get away from that, to just sort of think more about power, privilege, and difference in a systemic way versus an individual way. But I still think that when you have these kinds of programs, they're sort of based on things which the foundations could really crumble. And so I think I'd like to live in a world where when you do general leadership development, you're doing these things anyways. So general leadership development would mean that you're, of course, always talking about your leader identity in relation to all the other social identity markers that you have. Or when you do, relationship building, you're consistently aware of the way that you show up in space and how you affect others and how they're affected by you. I think these are fundamental things to any kind of leadership development initiative. But for now, this was just sort of to get the conversation going. So we focused on men's leadership.
I'm oftentimes just about to release an episode with Barbara Kellerman where we talk about scaffolding. So you could start with, theoretically, how are you as a listener? And in any leader development program, are we talking about listening? And is that kind of like fundamental? If you don't listen, if you're not skilled in listening, how do you build relationships? How do you build trust? I mean, it's kind of foundational. And so I think in the leadership development space, we have done a horrible job. I mean, sometimes we're walking into conversations about systems thinking in an introductory leadership course, and that's like flying a Boeing 737 out of the gates. You aren't starting with the Cessna, or even just like, these are the instruments on the airplane. You're going really big, really fast. And so, we were getting to this really kind of fun conversation about, well, what would some of those foundational elements be? Maybe it's reflection as a habit of mind could be another foundational, element. But I love how you're thinking, because if some of these pieces were woven in and woven throughout, then it eliminates the need for, men, women. It's just, we are all aware of and having conversations. And I think it's baked into it from the very, very beginning. And I think that's wonderful.
That's why I have a problem when sometimes people say like, oh, we're doing a social justice leadership. And I understand why they say that. Yep. But if you have to put that before leadership, then you're insinuating that's not a piece of it. And I would say that you cannot fundamentally be a leader or practice leadership if you don't understand how power, privilege, and difference shapes how you do that, right? Yep. And so I admire like the kind of initiatives that want to do like DEI leadership and inclusive leadership, but all of those kind of modifiers in the front, just like women's leadership development, sort of reinscribes leadership as something other than that. And I actually don't think that it is. So, So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, and I think as we get better as an industry and as a field of research, I think a major element of all of this is, how do we scaffold the work? It's been done in piloting. It's been done in surgery. If you want to become a cardiac surgeon, we've scaffolded the learning in an appropriate way. Architects, appropriate way. Attorneys. But in leader development, I don't know that we have done that work. And as a result, we're starting all over the place. And it might not even be that like there's one solid way. But again, I might use the Suzuki method. Wonderful. That's one way of scaffolding the learning. Of course, there's others. But I don't know that anyone has really come up with a real clear understanding of, where do we need to begin? What are those core topics that are fundamental and foundational? And we start from there. And then we move up. And that's just a fascinating, we'll have that conversation next time.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, sure.
Like there's topics that are so important, like this one, that have to be embedded. And if they're not from the beginning, I don't know. I mean, we can start with transformational leadership and Northhouse's textbook. We can start there. Is that the right place to start the conversation? LMX? No.
But I mean, it's a fundamental matter also of practice too. I mean, to your early conversations about how you hold space for these kinds of things, I tell my students often, like, it's just a matter of practicing talking about these things that you then become better at it. So if you're talking about privilege or power or things like that, I mean, one, it's a language unto itself, and the language is constantly evolving. So you need to get used to saying these kinds of terms and phrases. But in addition to that, it's all a matter of just like consistently doing it. So if you start at the basic level and you understand the basics, then you can start, as you say, like scaffolding and going deeper into like what gender inequity means, or going deeper into gender bias and how it affects you. And once you have a comfortability, at least acknowledging and addressing these things, then you go quite far.
Yeah. And if I don't have even some of those basics, like it could be intimidating for me to have this conversation with you because a couple times in the conversation, I've even in real time been worried about how to phrase something because it might not be the contemporary or correct way to phrase it, right?
Yeah, of course.
So that's happening all the time in so many different spaces. And so even, yes, having some of those baselines and getting clear on some of that is critical, because otherwise it stifles me. I stay quiet because I don't want to, again, offend or hurt or step in something I didn't know I was about to step in. And so I stay quiet. And then I don't bring my full self, or I don't feel like I can. And it's, again, it kind of comes back to that creating space conversation, but it also comes back to that, what are some of those foundationals that we need to do? And because for you, after 10 years of teaching this, you're pretty comfortable with it. I would be super uncomfortable with it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so you're my guide.
No, but you talk, I mean, I've listened to episodes. I mean, you talk a lot about like humility, you know, and I think that if you just approach these issues with humility and general kindness and an eagerness to learn, like I think for the most part, like people are receptive to that. I think, and also, you know, I don't want you to be nervous because I mean, think about my own positionality in this, right? Like I don't identify as a man, I identify as a woman. And, you know, and I'm telling a man like what I think he needs to do. So I think, you know, like there needs to be like a humility on both sides here where like I need to be really careful. Like I don't have the lived experience of men. I know the other side of it and I know the relationships that operate there, you know, quite often. And so this is of course just my interpretation. And I hope I approach it also with humility and sort of an eagerness to also learn, because I think exploring it further could prove beneficial for gender equity in organizations.
Exactly. Yeah, that humility, kindness, like you said, curiosity, openness, and just that working to be empathetic to try and understand the perspective of the other. Again, some of those foundationals that at least set the table for the conversation to happen. Nicole, I always end these conversations by asking what you've been listening to, streaming, reading, what's caught your attention in recent times. So it could have something to do with what we've just discussed. It could have nothing to do with what we've just discussed. But what's caught your eye that listeners might be interested in?
2 recommendations related to our topic and then one that's just a general one. But I, of course, would recommend Adolescence because I was late to watch that. So I know most people have already watched that, but that Netflix miniseries sort of on boyhood, I guess I would say.
Yes.
Like it's also filmed in a one shot, which I'm a big sucker for because I find that really interesting and like how they logistically pull that off. So I would recommend it not only for the way that it's done, but also just for the discussion that it has around growing up as a boy currently. And so I would recommend that. And also this movie called Men, which actually came out in 2022. It's an Alex Garland film, and it's kind of debated in the feminist community whether or not it's helpful or not. But I think beyond that, it sort of speaks to this kind of feeling, if I'm generalizing amongst women, this feeling of existing in patriarchy. And the title is Men, and it's a horror movie about men. And I'll just leave it at that, not to spoil it, but just about what would a horror movie look like if the villain was men. And the last one, I'll just say that I just love this film, and I just rewatched it last week, called Coherence. It came out in 2013. It wasn't like it was a super big blockbuster, but it's just about a group of friends that have dinner during the night of a comet and sort of how the decisions you make in life take you to different avenues and paths. And I think it's worth a watch if you like kind of a mind-bending life choices movie.
Oh, I love it. I love it. When I think of like life choices, I think of what was the Gwyneth Paltrow film?
Sliding Doors. Oh. Yeah, it's quite similar to that kind of a concept.
Oh, so fascinating. And then you can get into like mini worlds conversations where there's all these branches of our lives depending on what choice. Oh, so cool.
Yeah, I love stuff like that. So check out Coherence.
Mine that I'm just going to bring to the table real quick is have just fallen in love with the television show The Bear. I don't know if you've but that is just, it's whether it's a Jamie Lee Curtis and some of her acting, or whether it's just, you can look at that through the lens of organization development, and you can look at it through the lens of personal growth and development of the characters. I mean, it's just, so for listeners, Coherence and Men, Adolescence.
Yes.
And The Bear.
And The Bear. Yeah. And they do quite a bit of episodes in Copenhagen in The Bear. I don't know if you've seen. Yeah.
And when I was there for the International Studying Leadership Conference a couple of years ago, I mean, we went to our first Michelin star restaurants, my wife and I. So we went to Host and we went to a couple others, and it was just, oh my gosh. Oof. I can't wait to get back.
With good food. With good food. Yeah.
Nicole, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Thanks very much for the invitation to come on. And it's been really nice to talk to you.
So thankful for the opportunity to check in with Nicole, challenging us to think a little differently about how we do the work that we do. And, I always love conversations like we just had. They challenge my own thinking. They challenge me to step into the perspectives of others. And I think that is just a great way to be as a leader. We have to have that ability, that perspective-taking capacity to work to understand the lived experience of others so that we can make better sense ourselves. Because for each one of us, we suffer from about 180 cognitive biases, and my perception and understanding of the world is limited, extremely limited. And so I always appreciate those types of conversations and the work that Nicole is doing. As always, everyone, thank you so much for checking in. I appreciate you. Take care. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.